Hello, Life Group leaders. My name is Ken Gaines, and I'm going to bring you the lesson this week. We are in the book of Daniel, and our lesson today is entitled Future Seen, and this starts the prophetic part of the book of Daniel. And our lesson is going to be in chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. It's really the whole chapter, though. You're going to need to read all of that. You're going to need to read the rest of the minor prophets. You're going to need to read Revelation to get everything out of this today. Seriously, though, it's a great lesson. There's a lot here, though. So you're going to have to pick and choose which lane you want to drive in and kind of stay there just out of respect of time. I mean, we've got 45 minutes, and that's it. So there's a lot to unpack here. But be sure your class doesn't lose the reason God put this story in the Bible. He didn't do it to confuse us. So a lot of people say, I get really confused with Daniel and Revelation and all of this. 1 Corinthians 14:33 tells us God is not the author of confusion, and he didn't put this in the Bible to confuse us. So it's really good to study it, and we shouldn't try to shy away from that. We should try to study it, pray to the Holy Spirit to give us understanding, and put it together with the rest of the Bible. God didn't put it in here to tell us a fantastical story, which it is, but God's not an entertainer. He didn't put the Bible together to entertain us, like most of the other books we read. He put it in here to provide hope to us as we struggle in a troubled world. Hope in what? The hope of God setting up his kingdom that's going to last forever. And I know sometimes when I watch these videos, I'll get 10, 15 minutes in, and I'll say, I've got it, and then I'm out. Don't miss the last 2 minutes of this video, okay? So if you don't have time to watch everything, just kind of skip out to the last 3 or 4 minutes of the video and watch that part, because I've got some important things to say, and I don't want you to miss those if you miss any part of this. So the first thing let's talk about is the time frame. In verse 1, Daniel tells us that he has, when he has this vision, it's in the first year of King Belshazzar's reign. Now, we just ended chapter 6 with Daniel serving under King Darius, and then it mentions even Cyrus the Persian, there at the end. So Belshazzar ruled before both of these men. So this chapter is chronologically out of order with what we've been following. And Daniel's kind of set up that way. The first 6 chapters are pretty much chronological in order, but then the rest of the book is not. And that's because the rest of the book is about these prophecies, these visions that Daniel had, and it's set up that way so that we can concentrate on them, and they're kind of interleaved inside the other chapters as far as the time frame that they happened. This particular story here happened at the end of chapter 4 and before chapter 5. And so that's where it fits chronologically. But it's set apart so that we can concentrate on it outside of all the other things that were going on in Daniel's life. These final chapters, starting with verse 6 or chapter 6, foretells God's sovereign reign over everything, and that's what we're going to get out of today's lesson. So what was this vision that Daniel had? In verse 1, he also tells us that he was sleeping when he had this vision. So he was sleeping, he had this vision, and once he woke, he wrote a summary of the dream. So for as much detail as we have in chapter 7, if you look at these words here, in my Bible it says he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. There's a lot of detail in here, a lot of things going on, but for all of that, there were more things that Daniel saw, that he observed, that he did not put in here. This is kind of cliff notes of his vision. And so for as much details in here, not everything's in here. And so that'll be important on a point that we'll talk about in a little bit. It's no doubt that the Holy Spirit guided Daniel on what to write, what to include in this part of his book. so that it can be conveyed to us here in the present. So what's the scene? So the scene opens up. Daniel sees four winds, winds from every side, it says, stirring up the sea. So since the winds are coming from all directions, we know what happens when that occurs in Arkansas. We get a tornado, right? And so when it happens out in the ocean, you get this awful tempest. And so I don't know if you've ever been in a storm on the ocean. I have a couple of times. It's not very fun. So as hard as it is on land to be in a storm with wind whipping around and rain coming down on you, imagine being on an unsteady foundation, in the sea or the ocean, and all these crashing waves happening, the winds blowing. So there's great turmoil, and one of the things I thought about when I read this is God never promised us we would live calm and peaceful lives. He promised us peace by trusting in Him. But not by what happens to us in the world. When God says, I'll give you peace, He meant I'll give you peace by you trusting in me. He didn't mean He's just going to make everything perfect in our lives. We're not going to have any troubles. And so, this is a great analogy for that. So out of this storm come four beasts. And so we're going to talk about those next. Daniel describes these beasts in some detail. The first one that comes out of the sea is a lion with eagle's wings, and those wings were torn off. And then this creature was stood up on 2 feet, and he had the mind of a human, Daniel says. Then the second beast was a bear, and it was raised on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth, and it was told to devour flesh wherever it went. Then the third beast that came out of the sea was a leopard, and it had 4 wings and 4 heads, and it was given great dominion on the earth. And then the fourth beast, Daniel couldn't even describe it. He just called it a beast. He couldn't, there's nothing in the animal kingdom that was close to what he saw, and so he really didn't have any way of describing this animal other than it was a beast. Now, he did say it had large iron teeth and 10 horns, and so therefore we can see that we don't really have anything like that in our animal kingdom here on earth that looks like that. He also went into more detail that there was a small horn that appeared and pushed out 3 of the original 10 horns. And this small horn had eyes and a mouth that it used to speak out against God. And so all of those things are very important. So there's some other things to notice about these beasts. One is that the first 3 were directed in some way. So the first one had its wings torn off. They didn't fall off. It says they were torn off. So who tore the wings off of the first beast? The second one was told to devour flesh. So it didn't say that it went around and devoured flesh. It was told to devour flesh. Someone told it to devour flesh. And so the third beast was given dominion. Well, someone had to, it didn't say it took dominion and it made its dominion on its own. It was given dominion. Someone had to give it dominion. So who was that? Well, we know who it was. But Daniel doesn't tell us that the fourth beast was directed in any way. So I thought that was interesting, and you may talk about that a little bit, what that might mean. He does say the fourth beast is very different from the other 3, and so that was one way that I saw that it was different. But as we're about to find out in these next few verses, God's in complete control of all 4 beasts. And so another thing to note about these beasts is that they are all destructive. and very deadly. God did not pick butterflies and kittens to show Daniel. Every one of these animals in the natural form was deadly to man since the fall of Adam. Finally, all of these animals are unnatural in their appearance. They are divergent from what we have normally. Lions don't have wings. We don't have any beasts that have iron teeth. So all of these were similar to animals that we have, but they were not the same, which is Satan's MO, right? He emulates God, but he doesn't completely mirror God. So, a lot of people talk about, what does this mean? Who are these creatures? What does this represent? Well, luckily for us, God provided somewhat of an interpretation for us. So, and this kind of starts going outside of our lesson. We end in 14, but in 16, Daniel approaches someone that is there, and we'll talk about where there is in the vision. So I don't know if this was a saint or if this was an angel, but he approaches someone and asks them, what's the meaning of this? And so this angel or saint interprets for him and tells him that the four beasts represent four kings or kingdoms that will arise and rule. Based on the imagery used and the supposed chronological time frame, scholars have said these four beasts are thought to represent, in order, the kingdom of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And we know Rome ruled over the majority of planet Earth at the time of Jesus' birth and his life, his death, and his resurrection. So we get a little bit of insight about what these animals represent. So they represent kingdoms and kings that are going to rule on the earth. So let's back up a little bit, and we're going to talk about God's dominion. So after describing these terrible creatures, something happens in verse 9. Daniel sees God, the Ancient of Days, dressed in white, seated on his throne. So that typically signifies judgment, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Fire is coming out of the throne, and millions are serving and standing before him. So Daniel sees this just incredible sight, unbelievable, scene here of God sitting down on his throne, getting ready to judge. And he opens a book, and court is in session. It says, immediately the beast that had the horn that was speaking against God, so the fourth beast, was killed and burned with the fire that was coming out of the throne. The other three animals, or the other three kingdoms, they lost all of their dominion, but they were allowed to survive for a little while longer. Then something even more amazing happens. Daniel sees one like the Son of Man stand before God and was given dominion over all peoples forever and ever. And this is our hope today, just as it was Daniel's then. Note that Christ is referred to as a man, while all the other kings are referred to as beast, making a very distinct distinction there. And so, for Daniel's time, they were, we think about Daniel having these high positions and ruling over people and administrating. I would imagine Daniel would have given all that up to be free, because he still was not free. He was still, basically enslaved by the Babylonian Empire and then the Persian Empire after that. And so, and so imagine if you were in Daniel's shoes, but you didn't have any position. I mean, it was a dismal life, and so God's providing hope here for these people. All right, so what's the lesson? Why is this in here? Again, it wasn't meant to entertain us. It wasn't meant to, make us ponder and come up with all kinds of theories. So this is the part I don't want you to miss in your class. How important is it for us to dissect all the imagery and determine what the animals are, what the horns mean, all the other imagery? What does that represent? Well, in verse 15, Daniel says that his spirit within him was anxious, and the visions of his head alarmed him. So he didn't really understand what was happening. And then the very last verse, verse 28 in the chapter, this is after this saint or angel has talked to him, explained everything to him. He wrote some of it down for us, other parts of it he didn't write down. He's still a little confused, and he's not going to say anything to anyone about this because he's so confused. So, we should study this book. We should study the other minor prophets. We should study Revelation. But the value of this lesson is knowing God's in control in every step of destiny, if we want to call it that, for every person, every country, every president, every king, every ruler, every prime minister that's ever been or is ever going to be. And also, not only that, God's in control of every angel, fallen or heavenly. And so things are not just happening and God's looking down and saying, oh, I knew that was going to happen. He's actually controlling all of these events. So we as Christians should have our hope and our encouragement in Jesus Christ. We shouldn't worry about political angst. We shouldn't worry about climate change, financial futures, or anything else in this world that seem so prevalent on everyone's minds. Now, we live in the world, and God gave us common sense, to watch out for ourselves. We can't just sit around on the couch and say, well, God's going to take care of everything, so, I'm just going to sit here and watch. We have to live in the world, and we need to be active in the world, but we don't have to trust in the things of the world because we have something that's so much better to trust in. The kingdoms of this world are going to pass away, and that's what this chapter is about. And that includes the kingdom of the United States of America. But we have dual citizenship, and I'm stealing this from some other great preachers and commentators that I've listened to. We have dual citizenship in our home country here on earth and Jesus' kingdom. And Jesus' kingdom has the authority to have dominion forever. Our home country is going to pass away. And that's what's important about this lesson. So regardless of what your class talks about and what you focus on here, those are the important lessons. So, you might try to get through the beast and the vision itself, the front part of it, fairly quickly, and then really start to concentrate on verses 13 and 14. Just some quick asides. Another thing that was interesting to me was several times throughout the first part of this chapter, Daniel said, I saw or I looked. And in the translation in our book was said, I was watching. Several times he says, I was watching, I kept watching, I watched. So Daniel was paying attention to all of these things. It wasn't just happening to him. He was, inciting himself into the scene there. So there's some more discussion in the latter verses of the chapter about the fourth beast, and some other things are said. And so you might talk a little bit about those. Again, some of those things tend to speak towards the end times. And so if that's true, was the fourth beast really Rome, or is Rome going to rise again? I mean, there's all kinds of theories out there. An interesting thing in verse 25 is he does talk about this small horn that comes up and pushes out three other horns, which are three other kings. So this is someone who pushes out 3 of the 10 kings and speaks up against God publicly. And it says he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, which means basically just harass them, constantly. And shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and a half time, which is 3.5 years, basically. So the front end of the tribulation period. And I also heard someone else say, I thought was really interesting. Again, Satan loves to emulate God, right? And the number of perfection for God is 7. And we talk about the 7 years of, the end times, except it's not 7 years. It's never 7 years. It's always 3.5 years and 3.5 years, which is not the same thing. So, it's really interesting. It's like you add them all up, you get 7 years, except it's always 3.5 and 3.5. So it's almost the same, but not quite, which is, again, just Satan loves to try to trick everyone into thinking everything's fine, great, this is what's right. But it's really not. And if we're paying attention, like Daniel was, again, he was always watching, always looking, we're going to be able to see that. And so those are just some of the thoughts I had. But again, the big thought here is not who these represent, what these are. It's that none of these kingdoms are going to last. No kingdom on earth is going to last. Jesus' kingdom is the only one that's everlasting forever and ever, and that's the one that we need to concentrate on. So I hope this was helpful for you. Tough lesson in some regards, but in other regards, it's a really simple goal for us as Christians. And the hope in that is, should give us joy that, in the end, we know we're going to win. And so that's a great feeling. So hope you have a great class and have a good week.